The 2010 emergency budget has provoked many questions and not a little controversy. The kind of questions that are being asked are, were these cuts inevitable or weren't they? Are they progressive or regressive? Are the cuts that are being proposed too quick or too slow? Now, to help us answer some of these questions, we're joined today by Rickard. Now, Sean, you're an economist. You've got plenty of experience of dealing with such issues as these. What are your views on the situation?
Well, I think in answer to your three questions there, it's inevitable up to a point. We certainly need to reduce the amount of debt, but there's no doubt that this government has gone further than they needed to. There's an ideological element here. They are determined to shift the balance of spending from the government towards the private sector, and they are taking advantage of the current crisis to go further than they need to. Is it progressive or regressive? It depends who it really hits, and as people examine it in more detail now, they're beginning to think it is perhaps more regressive than they thought at first. But I think the central point here really is that if it's going to work, what has got to happen is that there has got to be the take-up by the private sector of the slack that is going to be created by government cuts in expenditure. Very large cuts in expenditure, incidentally, the size of which we have never seen in the post-war period. No previous government has dared to suggest the sort of cuts that they are talking about. But if we're going to examine how successful this is going to be, I think this little diagram will help. Essentially, you can see in this diagram how the economy fell off a cliff, literally. We faced one of the deepest recessions in the post-war period, and government really had no choice but to spend an awful lot of money to stop that turning into a slump. The question now is, how are we going to recover? Traditionally, we would have followed line A. We would have been back to our historical rate of growth within about 3 or 4 years, and during that period we'd have seen faster than average growth, and that takes down the unemployment, and allows people to spend more money. This time that is not a possibility. Because the government is going to be taking money out of the economy, at the very best we're going to follow the path of B. We are going to perhaps return to the long-term underlying rate of growth, but we will not catch up to where we have been. So the economy is going to lose a very large amount of money, and that means that probably any reduction in unemployment is going to be slower in coming. Any return to the welfare, to the well-being of people is going to be much slower in arriving. And even worse, there's a possibility that with the government taking so much money out of the economy, we will get a so-called double dip recession. We will actually see us slipping back into recession before we start to recover. So the stakes are very high.
So what's your estimate of the likelihood of success of the strategy the government's adopting?
Well, it would be very easy to say. It doesn't look very promising at all. But one has always been shocked, you know. I remember back in the early 1980s, many economists didn't believe that what Margaret Thatcher was proposing would work, and after a fashion it did work. But what has got to happen is that if the slack is to be taken up by the private sector, they really have to invest a great deal more than they have been. And we start off with a huge reduction in investment at the moment. And we are going to have to rely on selling a lot more goods and services to other parts of the world than we import. And again, you know, we've had developing a large trade deficit over recent years, so we're going to have to actually turn around completely our behaviour.
And your estimate of the likelihood of that succeeding is what?
Well, I would have thought in terms of probability, it's only about 60% probability. What we've seen is a huge reduction in the value of the pound, 20% down on average. That should be giving our exports a boost. To date, it hasn't materialised. Now, that might be just because our companies are taking profits rather than going for market share. But that in itself is not very helpful, because it suggests they're not really focused on expanding their export markets. In a time of recession, of course, when there is spare capacity, when there is doubt about the demand coming from consumers, there's obviously going to be doubts about investing in extra productive capacity. So you see the government really are crossing their fingers and praying that their ideology is right.
Sean, thank you very much indeed.